Good evening. I think we're all set. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the Executive Director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. This is our 11th year. We've given away 44 fellowships to working biographers who have now produced almost 20 books. More are coming. This whole program is funded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation. And before we begin, I have just a couple of little announcements. First, I'm glad to announce that a few weeks ago, the Alfred Sloan Foundation awarded the Leon Levy Center a 3-year, $330,000 grant to allow us to fund a 5th fellowship every year. This one dedicated to biographers working on scientists or technology people. And so I hope you can get the word out. The deadline this year for this particular fellowship is going to be March 1st. Secondly, I'm also very pleased to announce that last month the CUNY Board of Trustees voted to approve an entirely new program, degree program, a 2-year master's program in biography. And we expect this to be approved by the New York Department of Education next month. And if so, we're planning to recruit 10 to 15 students every year to start in the autumn of 2019. This is really a very unusual program. There is no such thing anywhere else in the country. And I don't know about England, but I don't think they have anything that's a degree program to train biographers on the art and craft of biography. And again, I want you to all get out the word. It's not only biography, but also memoir. And maybe some of you in the audience here are working on memoirs. But anyway, we are here this evening for what I know will be an extraordinary conversation about the very extraordinary Saul Bellow. Zachary Leader is a biographer's biographer. I mean, he has already mastered the craft of biography over many years. He grew up in California, but has lived in Britain for over 40 years. He was educated at Northwestern University, Trinity College, Cambridge, and Harvard. He's now a professor of English literature at the University of Roehampton in London. Among other books, he is the author of The Life of Kingsley Amis, a finalist for the 2008 Pulitzer Prize in Biography, and The Life of Saul Bellow, To Fame and Fortune, 1915-1964, which is just volume 1 of a 2-volume biography. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and I note just this past spring he edited a small volume entitled On Life Writing, a collection of essays about the craft of biography. Obviously, we're going to have to incorporate this book into our curriculum for the master's program. But we are here to celebrate now the publication of Volume 2 of his Saul Bellow. Here is what the late Philip Roth had to say about Leader's biography of Bellow. Quote, "As a friend to Saul, and as an awestruck admirer of his astonishing work, I was not always at ease reading portions of this painfully intimate biography. Nonetheless, the book's sweep and majesty, like that of its subject, are not to be denied." We also have with us this evening Martin Amis. I hesitate to introduce Martin, if only because I'm not sure where to begin or end. I think I will merely note that his most recent book came out last year under the title The Rub of Time, Bellow, Nabokov, Hitchens, Travolta, Trump, Essays and Reportage, 1994-2017. He is also reportedly at work on an autobiographical novel about 3 key literary figures in his life: the poet Philip Larkin, the novelist Saul Bellow, and our mutual friend, the late Christopher Hitchens. Now, this reminds me, Martin won't remember this, but in the spring of 1981, I flew into London, very jet-lagged, and I was immediately taken by Christopher Hitchens to a dinner party hosted by one Martin Amis. I was 29 years old and had no business being in the company of the already celebrated Amos, but decades later, here is my claim to fame. I was in London that spring to exchange jobs with the Hitch. He took my job at the Nation magazine for 3 months, and I took his at the New Statesman. My few months at the New Statesman were wholly unremarkable, but Hitchens had a grand time at the Nation, fell in love with New York City, and basically never left. So I want to say that I was responsible for bringing the Hitch to America. And now you see Amos eventually followed, so I'm going to claim him as well. Martin will now interrogate Zachary, but afterwards there will be a book signing outside in the hall. And at some point in these proceedings, we will be passing around little note cards where you can write down questions for the Q&A period, and then they will be picked up. So on that note, Martin, I turn the evening over to you.
Now, let's get started on this intriguing and, I agree with Philip Roth, occasionally painful biography. And I want Zach to begin by, in a minute, by talking about what success is for a literary American writer. It's not like it is in Britain. It was Henry James who complained that when Edith Wharton, his friend or acquaintance, wrote a new book or published a new book, she bought a new house. When he wrote a new book, I know he was American, but same applies, he bought a new wheelbarrow. That was the difference. But Saul, Zach, can you give us an idea of the magnitude of American success?
The success that Bellow had in 1964 with the publication of Herzog was on a sort of different level from that of most anyone else one can think of. He was well known before Herzog was published, highly thought of in all the intellectual magazines and better books pages, but he wasn't sort of Time magazine successful or celebrated. And the book opens with an account of the reception of Herzog, and I thought I mentioned with Martin that I might read just a paragraph or two at the very opening to give you a sense of the scope of his success. I'll read just a paragraph or two, not very much. The book begins, the launch party for Herzog was held on September 22nd, 1964, 2 days after Julian Moynihan pronounced the novel a masterpiece on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, and Philip Roth, the editor of the Partisan Review, called Bellow the finest stylist at present writing in America, in a review in the New York Herald Tribune Book Week. Alfred Kazin was among the guests at the launch, and while waiting for his wife to arrive, he amused himself by picking out, in quotes, the customers for Saul's party from the regulars at 21. The party was held at 21. It was so easy, says Kazin. The regulars were better looking. The party-goers, stamped with the difference of their background and their trade, deeply depressing. In they came, Arabelle Porter and Katie Carver, all the old loves, would-be lovers, friends and near friends, the hits and misses, all so stale, isn't it? Also bloody familiar. Only Bellow impressed. Saul, our plebeian princeling and imaginative king, standing there, gray, compact, friendly, and aloof, receiving his friends whom he had invited to 21. Saul alone of all the old gang has achieved first-class status. Within a month of publication, Herzog was #1 on the bestseller list, supplanting John le Carré's The Spy Who Came in from the Cold. Money began rolling in. New American Library purchased the paperback rights to Dangling Man and the Victim for $77,000. This is 1964. Fawcett paid $371,000 for the paperback rights to The Adventures of Augie March and Herzog. Guys, I'm rich, Mitzi McCloskey remembers Bellow declaring. What can I get for you? Can I buy you something? Do you need any money? On October 30th, his friend, the lawyer Sam Goldberg, wrote to Bellow to ask what he should do about the manuscript of Augie March. I'm sitting with a $25,000 manuscript. I have no safe here which can hold it. Are you going to dispose of the manuscript this year, or are you saving it for 1965, for tax matters, that is? And then Bellow went on and gave his house in Tivoli to Bard College, along with everything in it, and a lawnmower and a variety of other things, and a washing machine. By 1966, his reported income was $140,000, which is about $800,000 in today's terms. And then finally, Bellow wrote to a friend in February 1965, Stanley Burnshaw, the poet, in my simplicity, I thought the noise of Herzog would presently die down, but it seems only to get louder. I can't pretend it's entirely unpleasant. After all, I wanted something to happen, and if I find now that I can't control the volume, I can always stuff my ears with money. And it went on. He stayed on the bestseller list, #1, for a very long time, and the tax returns for the next 3 years were rather like those of the first 1965. So he had lots of money and lots of fame, and he wanted these things, but it was your famous double-edged sword.
Well, when he won the Nobel Prize, he did say, you know, I'm immersed in the glory and the horror of this tribute. But it does sometimes happen. I mean, Portnoy's Complaint, Philip Roth, outsold The Godfather when it was published. A literary success can become a universal success in a way that very seldom happens in Britain. But, and Norman Mailer credited his success, his very early success, with all sorts of sexual conquests that he wouldn't have got otherwise, he said. Yes. But Philip Roth, I mean, after the success of Portnoy, he wrote 3 very poor novels in a row, and wrote them very quickly: The Breast, Our Gang, and The Great American Novel. And I'm very impressed that in Saul Bellow's case, it didn't seem to, it had other effects on him, which we'll come to, but it didn't, his literary river wasn't diverted by...
No, it was, Mr. Samler's Planet, which is a very controversial novel, but I think a terrific novel, when I try in some ways to rescue from public opprobrium. Came out a few years after, 5 years afterwards. It was his next big novel. I mean, the money, he wasn't especially after money, he was surprised that he had as much as he did. It was important to him in relation to his family, which had always disparaged his literary ambitions. They thought he should go into business. His older brother, Maury, described him as a schmuck with a pen. And he adored this brother, who was very tough. And both his older brothers, Sam and Maury, and his sister, Jane, were very interested in business and property and investments. And this is when Bellow's niece, Leisha, remembers him saying, "Wo bin ich? Where am I?" when there were conversations in the family about to investing money or property deals and so forth. He felt it as a way of being part of the family. And he did make investments, and he did go into property deals, but he wasn't really interested enough in money to know how to do it properly. So he was always impatient for returns on his money and so forth. And it got to be a distraction, one of many distractions that all this fame brought to him. As happened to him a lot, one of his friends who was a writer was asking him about getting an agent, and Bellow said, well, I don't think you can have my agent. He belongs, as I do, to the nirvana of the harassed. That is, all the time distracted by this hugely burgeoning correspondence, by people wanting things from him, by people giving things to him. And as Martin said, it's an accomplishment to have pushed this to the side, and written something of strength and value, not 3 weaker novels.
He did, and he went on being generous all his life. And if you look at the letters, he's frequently saying to old friends, "You sound as though you may be a bit short of money. If you want some, I can spare it." So it didn't make him at all anxious about people only wanting him for that, I mean, as it often happens. But a very detectable effect of success was what you called in volume 1 of your biography, strenuous womanizing. And this opens up a huge subject, and we will, I hope, not so much defend Saul as question, well, the usual accusation is misogyny. But before we ban any examination of uneasy relations with the opposite sex, we should remember King Lear. See yon simpering dame who looks so pure, the fitchew, i.e. the polecat or the skunk, goes, nor the soiled horse goes to it with greater appetite. But to the girdle, to the gods inherit, the rest is all the fiends. There's stench, there's consumption, there's the sulphurous pit. That is Shakespeare. And when this question of misogyny comes up, I would like to say, but it's very interesting. It shouldn't be the case that only the harp-playing, corporation-running mother of 5 with a virile young lover called Raoul is the only kind of woman that should ever be held up for examination. Now, you say quite rightly that Bellow's women in the fiction cover an enormous range.
Yeah. Well, he didn't always help himself. He, in his public pronouncements and talking about women, he was a very defensive man and aggressive when he felt he was challenged. He was once interviewed by two women who asked why he never had any strong female characters in his novels, which is not true as it happens. And he said to them, they accused me of being a misogynist. I love the adorable creatures. He knew exactly what he was doing. I mean, he was provoking them. He was acting aggressively in response to what he felt was a coming challenge. I do, even when the characters in his novels are the sort of hotties, sexy girls or fantasy creatures,
But they're
you
not
find-
fantasy.
They're not really. I mean, what they're doing is they're appealing to the character's somewhat antique French-made notion of sexuality. And when at times they can't quite bring it off, in a desire to please Moses Herzog, say, or Charlie Citrine, and Moses Herzog or Charlie Citrine detect something that doesn't quite work, or a falseness or an effort about their attempts to please them and be sexy, he finds it endearingly human. It doesn't turn him off. The person behind the act is acknowledged. So even in the characters who, I once taught Bellow's novels at the Committee on Social Thought, where he himself taught for 30 years, and there were very vigilant female students in the class, and they said, the only women he likes are those who are sex pots and so forth. But A, it's not true, and B, if you look at the sex pots, they're human qualities, they're human imperfections, their complications are understood, and I believe treated with affection. It should be noted that this is a man who, though he married 5 times, he married very strong and intelligent women in each of the cases. These women were, as his middle son Adam said, he went for sexy maternal women who had very strong characters, very intelligent. Well, that sounds okay to me. And that it's more complicated, in other words, than is sometimes suggested.
Yeah, and very specifically and fascinatingly Jewish. I mean, he writes about this very clearly for a couple of pages in Herzog when he's going to see his Japanese mistress, and he says he violently desired her, and yet he didn't want to go, and it was to do with how centuries, millennia of codes about cleanliness and fastidiousness lay you open to strange anxieties, which I find always very gripping to read about. And he was, as you'd expect, an extremely complicated man. And it's interesting during this strenuous womanizing period that where you often blush for him. He's het up and emotional and proud, but he's still, during that period, and he never let it go, he's fascinated by Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy and angels, angelology.
Yes. Well.
And in stark contrast to how he was actually behaving in those days. But that never went away, and it was Rudolf Steiner, Owen Barfield, at the same time as he was applying himself. This was one effect of great success. This is tremendously invidious subject, likely to cause resentment, but it's the case that sexual success, as with sexual failure, is very self-perpetuating and magnifies itself. And success breeds success, and the opposite is the case. He never gave up on the idea of, and he prosecuted it. He went after it and read book after book about it, the Owen Barfield.
Oh, you want to get on to Owen Barfield? Just before you get on to Owen Barfield, in respect to his relations with women, if you got him at the right moment, he would acknowledge that there was something wrong about his extreme promiscuity during the 60s. Just 2 little quotes. He said, In 1980, in the 6th year of his marriage to his fourth wife, the Romanian mathematician Alexandra Tulcea, he said, "I learned to organize my daily life for a single purpose. That's writing. There was one other drive, the sexual one, but even that presently gave way. My erotic life was seriously affected too, in that I diverted myself with a kind of executive indiscriminateness without a proper interest in women." And then elsewhere he said, "The sexual revolution was terribly destructive to me. I took it as entitlement, the path to being a free man." His disappointment in the sexual revolution was mostly with himself, and he connected it to a materialism in America gone mad, and this pushed him towards these esoteric, philosophers. I don't know if it's quite right phrase to use. Rudolf Steiner and Owen Barfield, who was his most coherent expositor. Barfield wrote this book called Saving the Appearances, which Bellow really was seriously interested in. And he joined the followers of Rudolf Steiner. I'm sorry if people know about it and I'm telling them things they know, but are called anthroposophists. And there was a study group in Chicago that Bellow went to regularly every week. And the one bit of his correspondence in which he assumes a rather passive position, and wants lessons from the master, comes when he writes to Owen Barfield, who finally had to write to him and say, I really don't like this position you're putting me in. I'm not like that. I'm not your sort of father figure. He had interests in a world or a dimension beyond that of the surface reality which he pressed his head to and saw more clearly than any other novelist of his period, I believe. But he saw the surface reality as providing a way into something deeper. Attention, and he got this from the Romantic poets before he went to the anthroposophists. Like Blake, he thought that if you attended to minute particulars of the material realm, if you looked as closely as possible to a person's face or posture or gait, it could take you into his character, for instance. I mean, Wordsworth said that looking at the surface could let you see into the life of things. And Bellow believed there was a life of things below the material realm. And what's so great about his writing, one of the things that's so great about his writing, I think, is that he could never quite satisfy himself with looking just at surface reality, nor could he finally accept what needed to be accepted for him to become an anthroposophist or a true follower of Rudolf Steiner. And finally, Owen Barfield had to say, we really shouldn't talk anymore. You're not going to make the leap of faith. And he held these two together, and the tension is part of the strength. Any intimation of a spiritual realm is rendered with great delicacy and tact, and is seen as closely as he sees the drops of water reflected in a glass, or the set of a person's eyes, or the way they walk, and so forth. Anyway, yeah.
This hunger for the transcendental never went away, and that if you look closely at something if you look closely enough, it will reveal its essence to you. I ought to say that, that your book, Zach, has a very compelling heroine and a very impressive heroine, and her name is Janice Friedman Bellow, Saul's fifth wife, who's still a very good friend of mine, and who said that when asked about all his marriages, she said that he had to have love in the center of his life. And love was a great source of his power as a writer. And in a very late story by the St. Lawrence, he spells it out where he loves his cousins. And he's written a great deal about cousins. And he gives a semi-explanation at one point where he says they're not too close, but they are blood. And this seems to him a very fruitful positioning. But as a young boy, he used to sleep in the same bed as, Albert, and used to run his fingers through Albert's hair. And even when Albert violently throws off his hand, he never wavers. His love for him never wavers. Then there's this odd couple of sentences where he says, the hair grew in close rows, row after row, and it was love that made me see them so vividly. And he identifies love as being the center of his talent, really, his perceptions. And row after row, the hair grew in a way that still comes in and out of his soul, he says. But Janice Bellow was represented his longest and happiest marriage, and in her case, that of an equal. Although she was very much younger, she was just as earnest and just as learned. And the story of their affair, which turned into a marriage, where he said to her, she was a research graduate, he said to her one night, you look tired, why don't you come to dinner? And she thought, I know, pizza and dictation. When a professor asks you to dinner, that's what you usually get. And he answered the door in an apron and was offering wine. And in fact, after that night, they never spent a night apart. So tremendously romantic and fulfilling. And in volume 1, an observer says he wanted to change women. And this observer says, but why do you want to do that? You can't. And there was no need to change Janice. You talk about the Platonic dimension of it.
Yeah. Well, the subtitle of the second volume of the biography is Love and Strife. And it's meant to signal two worlds which were Bellow's worlds. One was a determination to be able to be loved and to love someone, much aided by the sort of Platonic philosophy that he partly got from his tradition of the great books, which he grew up with at the University of Chicago, and was reinforced with the presence of Alan Bloom, who spent most of his intellectual life writing about love and its influence. And Janice Bellow had been an undergraduate at the University of Toronto. She came to the Committee on Social Thought to do a PhD precisely because Bloom was there, not because Bellow was there. She wrote about love in her undergraduate dissertation. She wrote about Madame Bovary and principally about Madame Bovary, but other works by Flaubert. And then that became her PhD. And she really believed in these things in a way in which the other world Bellow negotiates, the world of jostle, strife, intellectual competition, and so forth, was very skeptical about. I mean, you know, this meeting they had in which Bellow said, "You look very tired, why don't you come have dinner?" He was 72 and she was 28. When I asked her, "Why do you think Bellow married so many times?" she said, "He was looking for me," is what she said. She was not joking. She was looking for me. When I asked Bellow's close friend at the University of Chicago why he married so many times, Richard Stern, the novelist, he said to me, "Well, you know, he'd meet a girl or a woman, and he'd project all these ideal qualities onto her, and then they'd get together and marry, and she would prove to be human, and so this would be a problem for Bellow." And I asked just about the only woman faculty member of the Committee on Social Thought, Wendy Doniger, about this. I said, "Well, what do you think about Richard Stern's theory that he projected all these ideal qualities onto the women and then they disappointed him?" She said, "Well, that's what love is, isn't it? These are two attitudes, quite different attitudes. I know Janice. I believe in the absolute sincerity of her feelings about Bellow. I believe she brought Bellow love. But there are other people who say, well, of course he was faithful to her. They met when he was 72. You know, these are two different worlds, and you have to, you have to at least give voice to them both. And this is what Bellow does in his writing as well. He's perfectly prepared to see the Strife world's view of the issues that move him, as well as to express his sense that in the world there is the possibility of transcendence and the possibility of love.
And the soul, the fellow soul that was destined to be the other half of you. Well, it's certainly true that things look rather different when you're 72 than when you're in your 40s.
You're not 72. I'm 72.
Yeah. I'm 69, so I'm almost there. But it's certainly true that he thought of his he said of his fourth wife, Alexandra, that she wouldn't be there when she wouldn't wheel his bath chair, and that she didn't have that kind of devotion and stamina that he certainly was thinking about. And indeed, such stamina and devotion would be needed in his case, because perhaps you can tell the dramatic story of what happened to him in St. Martin, I think, the Caribbean island, where he fell disastrously ill.
St. Martin, which was just pretty much flattened by the recent hurricane, is where he went to see if he could make sense of this novel he'd been working on for the last 10 years. I mean, he worked on it for the last 15 years of his life and never got all that far with it. It was called All Marbles, still accounted for. It exists in a 279-page manuscript. It's full of interesting things, but it's also very wacky, and its register goes here and there, and he was always having trouble with the tone. St. Martin is on a coral reef, and he ate some fish at a local restaurant that was poisoned with ciguatera toxin. which has no cure. Sometimes it can disable you permanently, and other times it can kill you, and other times it can sort of go away. And it was Janice's sort of determination not to be satisfied with the diagnoses he received locally, and to get him sort of medevaced back to Boston University that saved him. Nobody knew what it was exactly that had knocked him out, and he was in real trouble. I mean, he was in mortal danger from this illness. And finally, this doctor did chance his hand with a diagnosis and said he thought it was ciguateratoxin. And he was treated, and eventually, it's not that they cured it, but it went away and he got better. And he recovered, but he never regained his full strength. Yesterday at the 92nd Street Y, at the end of a talk I gave, a small, rather dapper man came up to me and said, "Here are 2 copies of my book. This is an example I want you all to follow. You can take 2 copies of it. Anyway, one for me and one for my sister-in-law, and it was the widow of the doctor who had diagnosed ciguateratoxin and had really kept Bellow alive, kept him alive to write Ravelstein in the last 7 or 8 years of his life. That was good to see. But he writes very well about the illness in Ravelstein. Philip Roth thought he wasn't sure why this should be in the novel, but I think there are good reasons for it to be in Ravelstein. It was an important fact in his life because it did reduce him. It did reduce him. He no longer had this strength that he might have had more strength. He might have been more mobile had he not been so knocked out by this illness.
Yeah, and I think I don't agree with Philip Roth. I think that those pages are integral to Ravelstein, his last novel, and it's an amazing bit of writing. It's an extended near-death experience, vivified by these dreams or visions that are, more real than reality, rather than less real, and sufficiently well. Who knows? But after he'd recovered most of his faculties, this would be towards the end of the last century, he succumbed to Alzheimer's. And it's, again, painful for completely different reasons to read about that, that visitation from Alzheimer's, and painful details that I'd never seen in real life, although I knew other people who were afflicted by Alzheimer's. For instance, that you forget that certain people have died. And Bellow, again and again, was devastated to learn that his sister was dead. And then you grieve anew, and it's endlessly renewed, these losses. And for it, again, I use the word invidious, but for a writer to lose touch with his rationality and is surely what my father used to call a bastard's headquarters, BHQ curse on you, just as it would be for a surgeon to have Parkinson's, shaky hands, just as it would be for a carpet layer to have a crippling back pain. The intellectual lives in this area, which is now being afflicted.
I was going to say about Rosie.
Yes, do. Yes.
Bellow and Janice had a child when he was 84. And as his memory began to fall away from him, I mean, Andrew Wiley said, the agent for Bellow said, and also the agent of Philip Roth, was talking to Roth in this period when Bellow was starting to lose his memory, and Wiley had just been to see Bellow and said he seemed pretty depressed, and Roth said to him in a very harsh way, well, you would be depressed, wouldn't you, if that universe was closing up on you like this, that universe he saw. But he became withdrawn, and he wasn't always attentive, and people would ask him all the time how he was feeling, what he was thinking. And his little daughter, there was no mistaking who this person was when his three-year-old daughter came up to him, whereas the sons and the close friends weren't always altogether sure that they were being properly recognized by him. And she had absolutely no interest in asking him what he was thinking. She wasn't able to do it anyway. But they played for a very long time patiently together, repeating again and again, as children like to do, pushing the spoon off the table every time. And his last caregiver was a film student and has wonderful video of him. It's one of the first things I saw of Bellow was that the astonishing patience with which he continued to play the same game with his 3-year-old daughter. And it was only later that it occurred to me that, well, I mean, it's he may not have recognized that he was doing it for the last 7 minutes, something like that. Very touching.
It's the other side of the coin to re-experiencing grief, is that you can't remember that you've already played that game with your daughter.
Yes, yes. Oh.
And he was a cheap date towards the end. I watched Pirates of the Caribbean with him, and the next night we watched it again. But how does one sum him up? We'll open it up for questions in a minute. And when I read a great paragraph by Saul Bellow, I think, what is it that he's got that no one else has? And it's a sort of authenticity you can weigh, almost. His words seem to be heavier than, I mean, in the sense of way more than anyone else's. And it's what is it? Integrity, or it's some quality that he has and no one else has. And do you have any?
Well, I mean, maybe we could end. I could read a little bit of that. Read maybe just the bath seed.
The wrecking ball.
Well, the wrecking ball. Yeah, I could read the wrecking ball. Yeah. It's a sweltering summer in Manhattan. Moses Herzog is walking along, and he sees a building being demolished, and here's the way Bellow describes the demolition of the building. At the corner, he paused to watch the work of the wrecking crew. The great metal ball swung at the walls, passed easily through brick, and entered the rooms, the lazy weight browsing on kitchens and parlors. Everything it touched wavered and burst, spilled down. There rose a white, tranquil cloud of plaster dust. The afternoon was ending, and in the widening area of demolition was a fire fed by the wreckage. Well, that's just how it would have looked. That's just how it would have been. browsing on kitchens and parlors, that sort of moment of stasis, and then the white powder falling down. Absolutely perfect. That it also fits into the narrative of a man who's falling apart, being wrecked by experience, is almost incidental. You get that, but it's first that moment perfectly seen.
And I thought of that passage very often at the end when it was as if a wrecking ball was swinging very close and browsing around his cranium. And the destruction was underway, and yet it's like an underwater cave. There are pockets of where the air is still trapped, and thank you. And he could, near the very end, he could give you a brilliant half an hour on figures like Knut Hamsun, of great interest to him, being a ferocious anti-Semite who once had a rather disappointing day with Hitler. And Hitler was in such a rage after Knut Hamsun came for the afternoon, because Knut Hamsun was deaf and didn't hear Hitler trying to sort of burst in with a rant. So it was still there, and in little potholes and crevices. Right, let's. These are questions written out. Is Bellow's hunger for the transcendental also somehow a hunger for the real, in a way that would make sense to us today in terms of memoir and autofiction? We can perhaps talk about this genre, which has the official name, life writing.
Yeah, life writing is meant to encompass all the different ways in which a life can be written: biography, autobiography, memoir, letters, journals. Some people think annotations are a way to understand someone's life, annotations in books. Court proceedings, wills, a whole variety of documents can fit into this. It's a useful term because the distinctions between different kinds of life, right? I mean, I'm sure the Biography Center here is very Catholic, and it won't stop you from reading an autobiography or from reading a memoir or something like that. But the forms bleed into each other, and it's good to be able to see the whole range. I'm the general editor of the Oxford History of Life Writing, a 7-volume series. The medieval volume is out, and the early modern volume is out, and they're published by OUP, and the range of texts that are looked at to find out exactly how a life was lived is astonishing. How many different ways in which someone can give an account of their lives. And when we get to the 7th volume, the contemporary volume, 1945 to the present day, there'll be several chapters on electronic forms of self-presentation, on tweets and Facebook and so forth and so on, all of which are ways people are coming to think of themselves and present themselves in the world, and as well as others.
It gets very complicated, and therefore more interesting when its fiction strays into life writing. Where, for instance, in Bellow's case, he would change a character's hair color in the last proof he saw, so that so-and-so wouldn't think this was him, or so-and-so wouldn't think this was her. That you have to cover your tracks, that there are some quite lowly duties involved in writing fiction, which in my definition is pure freedom. I mean, D.H. Lawrence, who started this overlapping of fiction and call it confession or life writing, said that the great thing about the novel is you can do whatever you like with it, and that is true. But and D.H. Lawrence was always in trouble with the law, usually for obscenity, but frequently for libel, and these are shackles that most fiction and traditional fiction, and certainly all pre-20th century fiction, takes its freedom from that for granted. So it is a contorted form.
Yes, Martin very generously, when I was writing the second volume, gave me some pages from the novel he's working on that were concerned with Saul Bellow, and they were pages about episodes in Bellow's life and times he was with Martin, which are documented in other places, partially documented elsewhere. But he'd purposely change the year just a little bit, so you couldn't count on it. I'm not sure why you did it, but the names are just slightly different. So in the end, there's something about it you could trust as what happened, but it's as though you were signaling this isn't just a biography.
No, well, I'm venturing into this life writing lark myself, and I started this novel 15 years ago, and find it very difficult, and it's not so much hurting people's feelings, which is certainly a consideration that I've never had before, because I've never written about my life except in my first novel, but to consent not to be free, utterly free, and that's why I insist on calling that novel a novel, in that I felt desperate for a bit of elbow room. Well, let's see if we do move beyond this next question. What was the significance of Bellow's relationship with Ralph Ellison? Now, this brings in all the Papuans and Zulus, and where is the Zulu Proust?
Who's the Proust of the Papuans, the Tolstoy of the Zulus? I'd be glad to read them.
Which brought a tornado of criticism because it seemed to some to be racist, which, as we all know, is completely radioactive as a subject now. But I think we agree that no one has written more penetratingly and vividly and lovingly about the African American, and those Chicago pieces that you quote from.
Well, I'm not sure about that last. I don't think I would agree that. He's written very interestingly about it. But he does do something that puts people's teeth on edge. He was deeply disturbed by what he saw as the complacency of liberal Chicagoans who went about their lives in Hyde Park or in the wealthy suburbs north of the city, the wealthy townships and so forth, had all the right opinions, but somehow managed to coexist with, surrounded by this great expanse of devastation. And the averting of their eyes from what he saw as the horrors of the inner city, the nihilism of the inhabitants of the surrounding slums, the violence of the lives that were lived there. He insisted in his writings in the Dean's December, and in this book he was thinking of publishing called the Chicago Book, portions of which were incorporated in the Dean's December. They focus on the devastation, the demoralization, the nihilism of the inner city life, and they pay scant attention to the causes of this suffering, of this what he saw as madness. He knew full well what the causes were. He had been a supporter of the Congress of Racial Equality. His earliest books were about racial discrimination. His very first novel was about a man who wakes up one morning in a Kafkaesque manner and discovers that he's changed into a Negro. And there's another early novel fragment called A Cat Love, which is all about racial discrimination. But he means to wake up the population, particularly of liberals, who manage somehow or other to lead a life without fully acknowledging the suffering that surrounds them. And as he itemizes the horrors of the life in the huge tower blocks, in the projects and so forth, there is a real, the instinct is to hurt and to sting like a Socrates in Periclean Athens, to make people be awake to the downside of this great material prosperity that the city also represents. And I can very well see people saying, well, wait a second, what's going on? You're not attentive enough to the actual culture that exists in these places. There is culture here. Why are you not talking about it? And why are you not talking about the discriminatory practices that make for this suffering?
And it hasn't gone away, and it's going to be with America, I think, eternally. I don't see, African Americans are very eager to forgive, and they forgave Dylan Roof, that maniac who shot, 10 people in South Carolina. And now we have a racist president, who is, what's the difference? Or he's exploiting those sentiments for electoral gain. But, black people are good at forgiving, but I don't think white Americans are. And they have the heaviest burden of all, in that they have a dirty conscience about all this. And the vengefulness of those who have committed an evil seems sharper in them. And with Trump giving his blessing to it, I loved Eric Trump's defense of his father when he said that they say my father's a racist. It's not true. The only color my father sees is green. What a ringing endorsement that is. Okay, Kyle.
All right, well, on that very politically relevant note, thank you, Zachary and Martin.